Note that government involvement was a necessary part of this. Building a railroad line over hundreds of miles was an expensive proposition. Just think of the millions of steel rails laid in long, snaking rows. Think of the tons of explosives necessary to carve tunnels through mountains. And think about the small army of men who were necessary to do all the work that made this possible. And then, once the railway was up and running, think of the tens of thousands of engineers, the coal miners, the railway porters, the telegraph men, the stevedores, who were necessary to keep freight and passengers flowing through the railway network. So all these expenses made railroads very capital intensive. They needed to have a huge pool of capital to begin operations and to keep the business going from one year to the next. And so this was made possible by a new form of business organization that emerges after the Civil War, the business corporation. So before the Civil War, most businesses took the form of family businesses or partnerships, or they were owned by individuals. But increasingly after the Civil War, these businesses took the form of what were known as trusts. We now call them corporations. At the time, the term that was used was a trust. So a corporation or a trust has a couple of distinctive characteristics. The first is that it has a charter, meaning that a government has to issue a legal document that calls the trust or the corporation into being. So its very existence as an entity depends on the authorization of the government. So the second characteristic, which comes from the first, which is sort of created as a result of these charters, is that corporations have limited liability. So limited liability means that shareholders of the corporation, so the company raises capital by issuing shares. When you purchase a share, that gives you an ownership stake in the company. So if the company does well, your share value increases. If it does poorly, it loses value. Now, if the company goes bankrupt, you as a shareholder are not liable for its debts, meaning that you might lose the value of the share, but you aren't going to be responsible for the debts that the company has incurred. So what this does is it creates an incentive for investors. It means that they're taking a risk, but the risk is not as extreme as it might be if you had unlimited liability. So in the 1860s and 1870s, the primary recipients of these charters are railroad companies. So the federal government in particular has its eyes on establishing a transcontinental railroad. So the companies that are going to have to build this railroad can't be authorized by state governments because it's going to be a national railway system. And so in the 1860s, during the course of the Civil War, in part to authorize a transcontinental railroad, also in part to prosecute the war, Congress authorizes charters to a number of railroad companies, particularly the Central Pacific and Union Pacific, which are the two companies that are going to build the transcontinental railroad. It authorizes charters to these companies, and as an enticement, it's also going to help to finance the construction of the railroads. I mean, this could be a very high expense, and so the federal government is offering incentives for investors for companies to build the railroad. And so one incentive is a massive allocation of federal land. So some 175 million acres of public land are offered to the companies that are going to build these railroads. So the rule was that you have 10 square miles of public land for every mile of grade that a railroad company builds. It's also going to offer government bonds. So 30-year government bonds are authorized to the railway companies. So they're offered $16,000 per mile of track grade, $18,000 if they're building west of the Rocky Mountains. So not only are the companies receiving grants of public land, they're also receiving federal bonds, and they have the opportunity to issue bonds of their own. So the railway boom in the 1860s and 1870s creates a situation in which investors are awash in capital. It's sort of this burgeoning of the financial sector. So one of the key players in all this is Jay Cooke. So if you recall, Jay Cooke was a Philadelphia banker who'd been instrumental in promoting and selling war bonds for the federal government during the course of the war. He had been the person who really had helped to keep the Union government solvent during the course of the conflict. And after the war, he gets into the railroad business. And he is one of the shareholders of, in fact, he's one of the leading lights of the Northern Pacific Railroads. This railroad is supposed to have a northern line that's going to span the Pacific. So Cooke is aware of the possibility that there might be a rival transcontinental railroad that's being planned by the Canadian government. And so in order to make sure that this isn't going to happen, he contracts with an agent in Montreal, a guy by the name of Hugh Allen, and Allen bribes something in the order of 150 members of the Canadian Parliament to ensure that they're going to drag their feet on the construction of the railroad, and this ultimately virtually brings down the government of John A. Macdonald in the Pacific Scandal of 1872. What happened with Jay Cooke was fairly typical of this time. So you have the government that's issuing charters, issuing contracts worth millions and millions and millions of dollars, and companies that are making money potentially hand over fist. So inevitably, this leads to collusion, it leads to bribery, it leads to kickbacks. They become a permanent feature of politics in the United States and in Canada in the 1870s. One of the most egregious scandals of this period was the Credit Mobilier scandal, which emerges in 1872. So the origins of this scandal come with the establishment of the Union Pacific Railroad. So the Union Pacific Railroad is one of these transcontinental railroads that is set up during the Civil War that is chartered by the federal government. So the Union Pacific has a license to build a railroad from the Missouri River to the Pacific coast. And in order to make this possible, the federal government offers substantial loans that amount to about $60 million. They offer 20 million acres of public land. And so the thinking behind this is that it's going to be a while before this railroad is going to be able to turn an operational profit. It's a substantial investment. It's in the public good, and therefore shareholders should receive favorable terms on which they can establish their business. Now, in fact, the shareholders themselves realize this. In fact, many of the shareholders and many people who run the company believe that they can't turn a profit at all on operations. So the way they're going to make money is through construction. And so what they do is they establish a dummy company. And the dummy company is named after one of the largest investment banks of Europe, which is Crédit Mobilier. But it's given the anglicized version of Credit Mobilier. So the way the scheme worked was that the Union Pacific would make contracts with Credit Mobilier to build the railway at rates significantly above cost. And these contracts would bring high profits to Credit Mobilier, which was owned in turn by the Union Pacific's directors and principal stockholders. So by 1872, the railroad had only cost, at that point, $50 million to build, but Credit Mobilier had billed $94 million to Union Pacific, and the Union Pacific executives pocketed the excess $44 million. Some of these profits, in turn, were used in order to provide bribes and discounted shares to congressmen, including the Speaker of the Senate, including the Vice President. And so by 1872, a newspaper reporter does an investigation, finds what's going on, and brings this to light. And so this is a scandal that nearly brings down the administration of Ulysses S. Grant. But the railroads were not merely significant because of their role in shady schemes of corruption. By the 19th century, they also represented a form of political and economic power never before seen.